Okay. I think we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Douglas Week. We're on day 4. We've already had some amazing events, so I'll just leave it a minute for people to start coming in. And we are now live on YouTube. So hello to everyone who is tuning in on YouTube. Great to see you. Great to see the numbers creeping up. Hello, hope you're having a good afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are in the world. So I will get started. Hi everyone, my name is Sarah McCready and I'm one of the organizers of Douglas Week 2021. I'm here with Kristen Leary as well, who's another core organizer. So thank you for joining us today. We're delighted to welcome you to Douglas Week, and we're very happy to celebrate Frederick Douglass and his journey to Ireland with you today, through which we explore the importance of remembering slavery and the intertwined struggles for liberation in Ireland and the United States. So before we begin this event, there are a few small things that we wish to note in terms of housekeeping. This event will last approximately 1 hour long. If you have questions, there is a Q&A box function in which you can submit questions for our contributors, and we'll monitor these closely as a team throughout the event. And we ask everyone please to be respectful to our panelists. For your information, this event will be recorded and it will be available for viewing in the coming days. We hope that you enjoy our next Douglas Week event, and I will now hand over to Dr. Nuala Finnegan. Dr. Nuala Finnegan will guide us through this event. Nuala is a full-time lecturer in Hispanic Studies in University College Cork. She's currently head of the Department of Spanish, Portuguese and Latin American Studies, and she has been a very kind and strong supporter of Douglas Week. So thank you, Nuala, and I will hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and we're delighted to be here today to share this panel with you, and I want to extend a warm welcome to everybody who is joining us from whatever part of the world you happen to be in. This session today, of course, is part of the marvelous Douglas Week, which, as Sarah has said, is in day 4 now, which is not only examining Douglas's footprint in this country, but also scrutinizing the complex legacy of slavery and interrogating those legacies and their connectedness with contemporary experiences of racism, and also exploring ways in which we might expand our anti-racist activism. So as you will all know, this particular session is dedicated to looking at the very interesting connections between Ireland and Cuba through the prism of these 3 extremely interconnected concepts of slavery, abolition, and empire. And we are fortunate to have 4 fabulous scholars present with us from different parts of the globe to help us to understand these issues, in particular the role played by Irish migration and certain key figures in the maintenance of brutal systems of slave ownership and plantation operation on the Caribbean island of Cuba. And our scholars today are joining us from Missouri, from Canada, and from Kinvara. And I think it might be snowing on all of those locations rather unusually, but not here in Cork, where I am located. So today's session, broadly speaking, will unpick the messy relationship that exists between slavery, abolition and empire, both as ideas, but obviously also as lived experience. And in doing so, they explore the very complex entanglements between all of these in relation to certain Irish figures. And this mention of entanglement leads me to shamelessly plug a recent book that has come out on the topic called Ireland and Cuba Entangled Histories, Irlanda y Cuba Historias Entretejidas, which I had the privilege of editing along with one of our contributors today, Dr. Margaret Brehony. We have been unable to have an Irish launch of this book yet, though it was launched on this day last year in Havana, in Cuba, just before the pandemic came to destroy so many lives and to disrupt our realities in ways that we could never have imagined. But part of the process of putting this book together led us down very interesting journeys. And I'm delighted to say that both Giselle and Jira, as well as Margaret, who are contributing today, all have essays in this collection. And part of the experience of putting this book together with Margaret, we learned about, we could so conclusively see the richness of the comparison between Ireland and Cuba and how much could be learned by studying them in a comparative frame. And it was clear very much that there was no one single narrative about the Irish diaspora in Cuba or about Irish migration to Cuba. And of course, the whole idea of entanglement suggests a process that is both complex and also ambivalent. And I think it is that ambivalence that we will turn to today, as all of these speakers are going to illuminate the roles played by different Irish migrant figures. And the first three speakers will concentrate on this particularly fascinating figure, James Jenkinson Wright, while our final speaker, Margaret, will move to consider the role played by another illustrious Irish family on the island, the O'Burks. So we're going to start with Kirby Miller, and we're delighted to be joined today by Professor Kirby Miller in Columbia, Missouri. Kirby is the curator's Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Missouri and a very distinguished scholar of Irish migration. He's the author of multiple articles, and I won't go into those all in detail now, but also prize-winning studies, including Immigrants and Exiles, Ireland and the Irish Exodus to North America, as well as Irish immigrants in the land of Canaan. He is currently working on the research on Irish migrants to Cuba in the early 1800s, and a new book co-authored entitled Catholics and Protestants in 18th Century Ireland, the Irish Religious Censuses of the 1760s, is due to come out, if it hasn't already come out, and he may tell us more about that during his presentation. So we'll listen to Kirby's research now, and we look forward to his intervention. So thank you so much, Kirby, and you can take it away.
I have been unmuted. All right, can you hear me okay? Yes, all right. My paper is called The Self-Invention of an Irish Immigrant, James J. Wright and His Family in Ireland, Ohio, and Cuba. In recent decades, some scholars have tried to normalize Irish migration history in accordance with neoliberal terms and values. Irish immigrants are no longer seen as homesick exiles driven overseas by poverty or oppression, but rather they have been reconceptualized as ambitious, adaptable individuals seeking economic opportunity and personal transformation, self-invention, if you will, suitable for success in a global marketplace. James Jenkinson Wright, the subject of this and the two following essays, could be a kind of malign poster child for this new paradigm, for few Irish immigrants adapted and reinvented themselves more successfully. In 1802, James J. Wright, recently arrived from Dublin, was 14 years old, living with his parents and four siblings in a log cabin on the Ohio frontier, working from dawn to dusk on his father's farm. In 1807, he escaped rural drudgery, moved to Baltimore, and became a clerk for a local merchant. 30 years later, James J. Wright was one of the wealthiest men in the entire Western Hemisphere. A self-described capitalist, he was senior partner in Wright, Brooks and Company, the largest merchant firm in Santiago de Cuba, trading in sugar, coffee, and manufactured goods between the West Indies, the United States, Britain, and Europe, all worth $1.5 million per year. He also owned a half-dozen Cuban estates, including La Gran Sofia, perhaps the island's richest coffee plantation. And he owned 350 slaves, at least 5 of whom were the mothers of the 8 mulatto children that he acknowledged in his will. It's virtually certain that Wright made his initial fortune in the transatlantic slave trade, which meant that, ironically, as the American and the British consul in Santiago, he was legally responsible for suppressing, or not, the source of his own wealth. James J. Wright's transformation was ideological as well as social. His parents were Quakers, members of the Society of Friends. But by 1833, Wright had become an ardent Catholic. To appreciate the nature of that change, we must remember that Quakers in Ireland, England, and the United States were extreme Protestants. Their religion was born in the English Civil War when Protestant religious and political radicalism briefly flourished, and it was planted in Ireland by officers and soldiers of the Puritan armies of Oliver Cromwell. According to family tradition and Quaker records in Dublin, James J. Wright's earliest Irish ancestor came to Ireland from Essex in 1649, allegedly in the very same ship that brought Cromwell himself. There were never more than about 5,000 or 6,000 Quakers in Ireland, and despite their origins and conquests, they often did not behave like other Irish Protestants. Very few Irish Quakers were landlords. Most were tenants, like Wright's ancestors, who rented a large farm on the Ram Estate in Ballinclay in North County Wexford. Or they were merchants, shopkeepers, and craftsmen in cities like Dublin, where in 1800, the bankruptcy of Joseph Wright, James's father, obliged him and his family to escape his creditors by emigrating to the United States. Irish Quakers were rarely accused of persecuting Catholics. Instead, Irish Protestant officials often persecuted Quakers because they refused to pay tithes to the legally established church or to serve in the militia or to pay wartime taxes. Quakers in Ireland and elsewhere opposed all forms of religious hierarchy. They not only rejected popes and bishops, they did not even have ordained ministers. They believed in absolute toleration. Everyone should enjoy complete freedom to seek religious truth by following what the Quakers called the inner light of conscience. Quakers believed in earthly as well as spiritual equality. They spoke plainly and dressed simply. They refused to doff their hats to honor persons of wealth and rank. They would not kneel to the king or even to God in their own meeting houses. In the Society of Friends, women were often preachers, and in general, women in the Society of Friends enjoyed greater equality than in any other church. At first, the Society of Friends allowed Quakers to own slaves if they did not mistreat them and if they taught them to read and write. But by 1770, Quakers on both sides of the Atlantic firmly opposed slavery and the slave trade. They even refused to sell or consume sugar, coffee, or other products of slave labor. In Ohio, many of the Wright family's neighbors were Quakers who had fled persecution in southern states like Virginia because of their opposition to slavery. Quakers who persisted in owning or trafficking in slaves were at first admonished, but in the end, politely but firmly disowned. In 1827, James J. Wright was formally disowned and expelled from Baltimore's Quaker meeting. Wright's other transformation was political. Traditionally, Irish Quakers avoided political parties and conflicts. In the 1790s, however, many Irish Quakers, including some of the Wrights and their relatives, were influenced by the ideals of the French Revolution, which to them seemed logical extensions of their own Republican traditions. James J. Wright's own father, Joseph, and at least one of his older brothers sympathized with the Society of United Irishmen. But in the end, Quaker pacifism forbade the Wrights either to join the United Irishmen or to help the government suppress it. The result was that in 1798, the family in North Wexford was trapped between the conflicting and violent demands of the rebel and the loyalist forces. The effects on the Wrights were traumatic and long-lasting. In Ohio, 7 years later, James's older brother responded to news of Robert Emmet's 1803 rebellion in Dublin by denouncing the rebels as, quote, lawless banditti, and by admitting that he had, quote, long since lost all those romantic notions of liberty that formerly inspired him. Decades later, the elderly Joseph Wright, James's father, although secure and happy on his Ohio farm, was still, quote, troubled in mind with fear that Daniel O'Connell's repeal campaign would provoke in Ireland a, quote, reenactment of the scenes of 1798. It may be that James J. Wright himself had been disillusioned by the terrors of 98, especially when followed so quickly by his father's bankruptcy and the family's hasty emigration. But not all his relatives embraced conservative views. In their letters to Ireland, Wright's parents and siblings praised the democracy and equality they found on the Ohio frontier. In America, at least two of James's own siblings remained or became sympathetic to Irish nationalism. Brother Nehemiah named his youngest son after Robert Emmet. Brother Benjamin attributed his own radical anti-slavery and democratic convictions to his Irish birth in 1798, the year of liberty, he called it. And Benjamin's US-born children passed on to their offspring the myth that Joseph Wright, their Irish grandfather, had not been a fugitive bankrupt, but instead a united Irishman exiled for rebellion against English tyranny. But in contrast to his family's republicanism, James J. Wright in Cuba proudly proclaimed himself a loyal subject of Spain, arguably the most reactionary monarchy in Western Europe. His transformation was symbolized by signing his name as Santiago rather than James in his letters to Ireland. Moreover, Wright not only embraced slavery as a source of wealth and status, he justified it ideologically on both racial and philosophical grounds. In his letters, he argued that Africans were inferior to whites and that human inequality was, quote, natural and desirable. Society, he wrote, should be hierarchical and paternalistic like his own plantation. It was order and tradition, he wrote, not freedom or progress, that promoted harmony and happiness. For Wright, human beings were too, quote, imperfect for democracy, and all reforms invariably produced disorder. He repeatedly praised what he wrongly described as Cuba's, quote, peace and tranquility. He dreaded the prospect of revolution, even in his own native land. Reports of social and political unrest in Ireland disturbed him, for he believed that, quote, we have more security for life and property here in Cuba than you have in Ireland. He even advised his relatives that Ireland should be more like Cuba, where he claimed wealthy plantation owners like himself were much more benevolent than Irish landlords. And as a result, the slaves were much better fed, clothed, and housed, and hence much happier and much less rebellious than the Irish peasantry. Finally, perhaps James J. Wright's greatest self-invention was his attempt to convince his relatives that the Wrights had not come to Ireland with Cromwell in 1649, as commonly believed, but instead had crossed the Irish Sea from England almost a half-century earlier and in dramatically different circumstances. Wright now proposed a new origin myth, according to which his ancestors had lived in Yorkshire and had belonged to what he called, quote, the Spanish Catholic Party in England. After their participation in the failed gunpowder plot of 1605, they had fled for refuge to Catholic Ireland, where somehow 40 years later, they had reemerged, cleverly disguised as Quakers. To be sure, there was a certain similarity in the two origin myths. Guy Fawkes and Oliver Cromwell were both regicides, the one aspiring, the other successful. But Wright's dubious claim only illustrated once again that few Irish immigrants reinvented themselves so completely and ingeniously. And of course, even fewer had such compelling reasons for doing so. For like the Paris of another convert, Henry IV, the profits and the pleasures of La Grande Sophia were surely worth a mass. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirby. And I'm sure the audience have appreciated that presentation very much. And already we can start to understand how this research is unsettling or troubling some of those myths that we have around Irish migrant figures to this part of the world and to others. So we're going to continue to learn more about this figure of Wright, of James Santiago Wright. And I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, Jira Burton, who is going to share some of the results of her recent research into this figure. Gera is a native of Dublin and is a graduate of both UCD and the University of Missouri, where she earned a PhD in Latin American and Afro-Hispanic studies. She is a major expert on the figure of Richard Robert Madden, and is currently working on a biography of that figure, having already written extensively on him, including a monograph called Ambivalence and the Post-Colonial Subject, the Strategic Alliance of Juan Francisco Manzano and Richard Robert Madden. So we're delighted to welcome you here today, Jira, from Missouri, and we look forward to hearing your presentation now.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I can only see my screen. Is that okay? My presentation?
Yeah, that's fine. If you're not sharing any content, that's fine.
Oh, I'm sharing my presentation now.
Oh, we can't see your presentation at the minute, Gera.
Oh, let's see. Oh dear.
So have you clicked the green button, share screen on Zoom?
Share screen, yes.
Yeah, so that should come up then. You should have the document open already.
Okay. Sorry about this.
Oh, there we go. That's you now, Gera. Thank you.
Okay. All right, here we go. Thank you. Thank you for being here. In his deposition at the 1839 trial of the Americans involved in the Amistad case, Dr. Richard Madden stated, "I have complete knowledge of the slave trade in Cuba. I know that there has existed no law since the year 1820 that permits the introduction of Negroes from Africa into this island of Cuba for the purpose of converting them into slaves." Madden testified that the 52 Africans from the Amistad had been kidnapped by slavers from the west coast of Africa and introduced to Cuba, making them, in fact, González, the term used in Cuba to denote persons who were free, who were liberated. Now, this evidence, as affirmed by US President John Quincy Adams, proved to be one of the most important of the case. So Madden had gained a reputation as an abolitionist based on his activities as a member of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society and for his efforts in Jamaica as special magistrate under the terms of the anti-slavery treaties outlawing the slave trade. On August 1st, 1834, he was present in Spanish Town, Jamaica for the Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves throughout the British Empire, with the exception of India. So when the Irishmen arrived in Cuba 2 years later in 1836, the Captain General Miguel Tacón already considered him a dangerous man, having tried and failed to block his appointment as superintendent of liberated Africans in Cuba. Madden promptly discovered that the Cuban authorities blatantly disregarded the terms of the Anglo-Spanish treaties outlawing the slave trade. Facing Cuban intransigence, Madden criticized the various measures taken by the colonial government to circumvent the legislation and evade the patrols of British Navy squadrons, including the practice of switching flags on vessels to help disguise the cargo of human beings, the illicit cargo of human beings. He also highlighted the existence of at least 5 barracones, or slave barracks, located very close to the residence of the Captain General and to the numerous others established throughout the island to illegally detain the Africans captured, transported to Cuba, and smuggled across the island. Further, Madden accused the local authorities of colluding and conspiring with the slave traffickers. In fact, the Captain General received a tax of $10 for each African brought to Cuba in chains by means of the so-called voluntary contribution. Now, United States and British consul in Santiago, former Irish Quaker James J. Wright, planter, coffee merchant, and notorious slave trader, resided in Santiago for about 3 decades. He shared various business investments with his associates Brooks, Hardy, and Shelton. Another of his adventures, Wright, Shelton and Company, was described as a famous English financial house. One partner, Thomas Brooks, had established himself as a businessman in the 1830s and became United States consul in the 1850s. British consul and senior partner John Hardy owned the majority stake in the profitable Cobre mine, copper mine, outside Santiago. During the first half of the 19th century, this mine became the world's leading copper mine. Furthermore, the quality of the copper from the Santiago mine exceeded that produced by English mines, yielding twice as much pure copper. In 1846, the value of the copper mine exported to England was given as in excess of £400,000, which would have been in the region of £30 million in today's currency. And from that, the British government received import duties of approximately £3 million by today's value. Mine workers included immigrants from Cornwall, the Canary Islands, and along with African slaves who became the property of the mine. Madden's travels in Cuba with his successor, David Turnbull, revealed that the authorities were blatantly ignoring the legislation. There was blatant disregard for the 1835 Act, which Spain had signed with England. They noticed the presence of Black laborers, English-speaking British subjects in the eastern part of the island. They'd been transported to British colonies from British colonies to Candelaria, an area between Gera and Holguin, the so-called British Cuba. And they were brought as laborers. These were individuals who should have been liberated. In the town of Cobre, Turnbull counted over 900 workers whose complexions ranged from ebony to alabaster, more than half of whom were enslaved as property of the mining enterprise. The economic interests of the US and British consuls and those of the colony's slave trade dependent economy had become closely aligned, despite the legislative measures outlawing the odious commerce. Throughout the surviving epistolary collection that my colleagues and I have examined, James J. Wright adopts a racist hierarchical discourse. In a letter dated the 6th of October, 1837, addressed to his cousin Jonathan at Christchurch Place, actually a very close to the cathedral, he stated that all men cannot be equal. There are distinctions that I believe will live in heaven, the scale of human beings as a graduated thing. Further on, he writes, I observe that you, in common with our Irish countrymen in general, attach a somewhat undue strength to the African character. Now, Wright only mentions Madden by name twice in his correspondence, but he mentions that Madden belongs to a clique to which he is diametrically opposed. His correspondence with his Aunt Martha from Santiago reflects the sharp contrast between his compatriots' motivations. Despite never having met Madden, Wright expresses his antipathy towards his and Turnbull's abolitionist activities. On the other hand, he defends US Consul Nicholas Trist, a known supporter of slavery, whom he regards as an honorable man incapable of telling lies. Responding to a request for information about Madden from his cousin Jonathan Wright, dated the 8th of July, 1842, James writes, you ask me what sort of man is Dr. Madden. He proceeds to point out that he completely concurs with Nicholas Trist's opinion of both Madden and Turnbull. Quote, no two more noxious individuals ever were residents of this island than these two individuals. They both have done everything possible to introduce discord and strife into our happy and tranquil country. Wright's criticism appears in response to an 1839 letter that Madden had written, exposing the abuse of the US flag in the protection and promotion of the slave trade, and revealed details of US Consul Nicholas Trist's role and that of US capital in the nefarious enterprise. In several letters, Wright attempts to justify his actions by asserting that he no longer personally engages in commerce, but remains as a silent partner who does not participate in the daily running of the enterprise. I am sorry to observe, he writes, that the poor of our native country, Ireland, are not as satisfied as our slaves here, who are well lodged, clothed, fed, and with their wives and children around, and address their masters with more freedom and confidence than the poor do the rich in Ireland. He attempts to justify slavery by writing that the slaves are much better off than in Africa, then speculates that the reason for his aunt's refusal to correspond with him is possibly due to her disapproval of his involvement in the system of slavery. Later, he tries to convince his aunt Rachel that the £50 he'd earlier sent her, which would have been about 3,000 by today's account, that the £50 he'd sent to her had not been derived from the proceeds of slave labor, but rather from his legitimate investments, his legitimate profits from the commercial house. Following Rachel's demise, among her belongings, the family discovered an uncashed bank draft from her nephew in the amount of £50. James J. Wright's letters reveal a paternalistic attitude toward the 350 slaves from the Gran Sofia coffee plantation, whom he refers to as my Negroes. His discourse provides an insight into the mindset of an entrepreneur, a conservative, an opportunist, resistant to change, a cagey businessman obsessed with the maintenance of tranquility so that the colonial system may operate in the best interest of investors. What emerges is the portrait of a man who's been living in a virtual bubble far from Havana, in far-off Oriente province, outside Santiago, in the wake of several uprisings of slaves and free persons of color during the 1830s and 40s. And I don't have time to go into those, but the most important ones would be the one on the Acana plantation. Wright plays down the news of any unrest in Cuba, dismissing reports as riots among Blacks. Of course, Wright was personally unaffected by the reprisals inflicted by the colonial government on the enslaved and free Black population in the aftermath of uprisings that included torture, imprisonment, and executions. A firm believer in capitalism, Wright arrived in Cuba attracted by the promise of supernormal profits derived from the trafficking of human beings. Proud of his accomplishments, he brags of various titles within my reach, should I think proper to attain them. Abolitionists, including Madden and Turnbull, he regarded as a threat to colonial economic interests, convinced as he was of the existence of many enemies jealous of our prosperity. On October 29, 1843, he tells his Aunt Martha and his cousin Jonathan that Santiago has all the quiet and tranquility of a friend's meeting, emphasizing that newspaper reports are untrue, that the writers under some malign influence deal in a continued tissue of lies, his version of fake news. Incapable of understanding the motivation of individuals, guided by humanitarian principles rather than personal gain, Wright remains firmly opposed to the activities of those who, facing intimidation and threats to their personal safety, devoted their lives to suppressing the slave trade, including his compatriot Richard Madden, the indefatigable enemy of slavery and oppression in every form.
Thank you very much, Jira, and for deepening our knowledge of this figure and in revealing so much about him through the letters that he wrote and uncovering so many of the other archives and documents. We're delighted to move now to welcome Giselle González Garcia and to continue this journey into the figure of Wright. Giselle is a graduate of history from the University of Havana in Cuba from 2016. And when I had the pleasure of meeting her in 2017 in Cuba, I know that I was not alone in being mesmerized by her knowledge and the scope of her authority over her subject matter when she presented to us on her research. So it was no surprise to any of us that she was then awarded a scholarship and has moved to Concordia University, and where she completed her master's in this past year with a thesis entitled Caught Between Empires, pre-famine Irish immigrants in Santiago de Cuba between 1665 and 1847. And she's currently working on her PhD there with her main research topic as Irish immigration to Cuba during the 19th century. So welcome, Giselle, and we're delighted to hear you speak to us today.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Okay. So my presentation today is titled An Irish Quaker in Santiago de Cuba, Coffee Plantation, Slavery and the Slave Trade, 1808-1847. In the first half of the 19th century, Santiago de Cuba became one of the most important coffee producing regions in the world. This was intrinsically connected to the influx Cuba's eastern region received from the neighboring island of Saint-Domingue after the revolution that had took place there. So between 1790s and 1812, a multinational conglomerate of foreign adventurers arrived in Santiago. By 1812, the members of this group were a small but influential cohort of newly settled planters and merchants, some of them combining both of these roles. Among them were some Irishmen who can be traced back to Baltimore and Philadelphia, and from there to Ireland, specifically to Dublin and to counties Antrim, Armagh, Cork, Donegal, and Wexford. As members of this cohort, I can mention James Jenkinson Wright, which is the person we have been dealing today, but there were others also known, like Richard Maxwell Bell, who became Ricardo Maria, William and Samuel Wanton from Ballintra in County Donegal, Simon and Cornelius O'Callaghan, and Felipe Boylan. So today, out of time constraint, I will only talk of James J. Wright as a case study. However, I want you to keep in mind that the pattern of behavior that I found in him in terms of dealing with slavery and engaging in the slave trade can also be found in the rest of the Irish Quaker migrants to this region. I will show you quickly. This is the larger group that I found, but I only will be focusing on Wright. So my paper will examine Wright's interaction with slavery, with his insertion in a coffee plantation-based economy, and his involvement with the slave trade. I hope to contribute to the general scholarly debate around Irish involvement with both of these issues. In spite of the intentional destruction of many records that documented the slave trade, some have survived and can be retrieved as irrefutable proof of Irish migrants' participation in it. I do not claim that all Irish migrants to the Spanish Caribbean endorsed slavery, yet Irish men and women who supported and profited from slavery have been neglected, and their painful memory considered for a shameful footnote in the history of Ireland and the Irish diaspora. My approach rather intends to deepen the complexity of the positions some Irish migrants found themselves in socially, especially in the Spanish Caribbean, and to complicate oversimplistic understandings of the enslaved, the enslavers, and the societies in which they live. For example, as it was already mentioned, Dubliner James J. Wright became the biggest holder of African enslaved people in Eastern Cuba, while being a Quaker-born convert to Catholicism and a Spanish subject holding the offices of United States commercial agent and British proconsul. So how are these evident contradictions explained? My colleagues have already provided some of the answers, but I hope to add more details to them. So it is often claimed that coffee is Cuba's national drink per excellence. Its consumption has persisted through time and survived even the complete collapse of the industry after the independence wars. Cuban coffee and the cultural practices around it are still an important indicator of identity. Coffee has become a common cultural signifier that unites today's widespread Cuban diaspora. However, the success of Cuban coffee cultivation is deeply linked to a French immigration and culture and its exports to the global markets to a generically homogeneous North American group of merchants. And these umbrella terms frequently found in Cuban economic history does not differentiate among Irish, Scottish, Irish Americans, Anglo-Americans, and others. Moreover, when one reads the list of French coffee planters, one finds discernible Irish names. In 19th century traveler literature, Santiago's coffee plantations were often described as an earthly paradise, but a paradise for whom? Most certainly for a white planter class that conceived of the cafetales as a social space in which they had an opportunity to display competing notions of beauty and taste. Sustaining the coffee economy were the often anonymous enslaved laborers who were responsible for the maintenance of the so-called paradise. In a map, and you see it here at the bottom, in a map considered the map of coffee planters in Santiago de Cuba, I have highlighted those with an Irish connection. As you can observe, it was Dublin-born James J. Wright, here highlighted in yellow, who had the largest concentration of land in the area. And he even managed to co-own or own at least 6 different plantations, of which La Gran Sofia stands as the most remarkable of all in Eastern Cuba. By the way, is a UNESCO heritage site today. So La Gran Sofia plantation is located in La Sierra de la Gran Piedra at 800 meters above sea level. Its most striking feature was the size of its slave barracks. Local experts estimate that around 100 enslaved laborers were housed there, but James J. Wright himself reported around 300, 350 in his personal correspondence. Today, this plantation is considered an important heritage site, and it is interpreted as a key material remnant of the coffee cultural landscape of Eastern Cuba. In a city like Santiago, whose inhabitants are mostly focused on the celebration through memorialization of its French pedigree, La Gran Sofia stands out as an Irish connected site. But La Gran Sofia is just one of many Irish coffee plantations in the area, the majority of which have not been even linked to a memory of Irish immigration to Santiago de Cuba or study as such. For example, Wright's second plantation, Kentucky, was one of large surface area, and it can be claimed that after La Gran Sofia, it is the second in importance in the area. Now, I would like to turn into a different issue, connected issue with that of the slave trade. So in the period between 1801 and 1810, hundreds of coffee plantations were created all over Eastern Cuba. Part of the capital invested in this undertaking is registered to have come from the French and other foreign settlers. Another part, however, specifically that of the Irish Quakers that I'm dealing with here, came from one particular source, the infamous slave trade, which was very profitable, especially after it became illegal. After 1808, in the words of Nini Rogers, and I quote, "The external slave trade was banned without touching the internal institution of slavery," end of quote. Due to British pressure, Spain finally outlawed slave trafficking in 1820. However, the Spanish colonial authorities in Cuba, whose economic interests often lay in the maintenance of slavery, were complicit in its continuity. Statistical evidence demonstrates that the traffic actually intensified after it was prohibited. More than 85% of the African people trafficked into the island were imported after this activity had been declared illegal. The official narrative of condemning the slave trade while not making any real attempts to actually suppress it helps explain why, by 1827, James J. Wright had gained a reputation as trafficker. It is difficult to determine the level of involvement that Wright had with the so-called African trade. Like many other employees in this piratical enterprise, he made sure that evidence of his involvement did not survive. However, small traces suggest that Wright was involved with the slave trade since the early 1820s, perhaps even earlier. The evidence is scarce, but cannot be ignored. Wright's earliest recorded involvement with the illegal traffic dates back to December 1820 and is documented on the Transatlantic Slave Trade database accessible online. The names Wright and Shelton appear as owner of the schooner Ana Maria, a Spanish vessel captured by the British and tried at the mixed court in Sierra Leona in May 1821. Hundreds of business letters on top of Wright's own personal correspondence to his aunt Martha Wright in Dublin, record that his most important business partner was Boston native Henry Shelton. Their business partnership started around 1814 and lasted for a few decades until Shelton's untimely suicide in 1838. In 1828, a decade earlier, British patrols had captured the vessel La Fanny, after it was reported by a member of his crew for having both French and Dutch papers. Upon a closer inspection, the British Mixed Court of Justice in Sierra Leone, an institution that had been created to hold people responsible for engaging in the illegal trade, determined that La Fanny's port of departure had been Santiago de Cuba, a Spanish port. After the Mixed Court judges interrogated the 22 members of his crew, the British authorities suspected that the owner of the vessel was, and I quote, Mr. Wright, either an Englishman or an American who resides opposite the wharf at Santiago de Cuba. Wait a second. Yes. So there are several key facts in this record which suggest to me that the Wright in this account is actually James J. Wright. First, his presence in Santiago de Cuba in 1827 is well documented, as is the location of his residence opposite the wharf, where his company, Wright and Shelton, had leased a house that doubled as warehouse, town residence, and for a number of years, official seat of the British consulate. Second, the witness account that this Wright was either an Englishman or an American is consistent with Santiago's archival collections, in which he is often described as Irish, but also as Anglo-American. French travelers who published their reports about their travels in Santiago often mistook him for an Englishman. And finally, as it has already been mentioned, the Baltimore Monthly Meeting of Friends had disowned Wright in May of 1827. The same year that this same year when La Fanny's ship was captured. And after having confirmed that Wright was holding his fellow men in bondage and being concerned in the African slave trade, all of this evidence put together to me suggests that Wright had already gained a reputation as a trafficker prior to his expulsion, and therefore he is the Wright mentioned in this British report. Finally, I would like to say that the institution of slavery and the illegal trafficking of human beings made it possible that millions of people were perpetually forced to work. Enslavers who identified as Irish and as Quakers turned Roman Catholics, such as Wright, quietly but significantly contributed to upholding this institution and economically benefit from it, even when it contradicted their religions and moral codes. In just one of his plantations, La Gran Sofia, James Jenkinson Wright managed to hold under bondage the considerable number of 300 people. And this is significant because most scholars agree that coffee, unlike sugar, did not require a large labor force. I suspect that he also trafficked into the country thousands more. So when he died in 1845, his fortune was estimated well over $1 million in that time's money. In today's money, it's like significant fortune. I will leave it here, but I'll take any further questions later.
Thank you very much, Giselle. And again, we're really getting a very vivid picture of Wright, having learned about all of the different dimensions of him. And thank you also for revealing kind of the full extent of the horror of the estate of La Gran Sofia. And I know that there will be many, many questions from our audience about the connection between Ireland and slavery through the figures of people like Wright, but who was one among so many, as you so brilliantly illuminated for us. Our final presentation as part of this session is from my colleague, Margaret Brehony, who works in the Department of Spanish, Portuguese and Latin American Studies at University College Cork. And Margaret is a Mary Skłodowska Curie Caroline postdoctoral fellow in the department, with a really fascinating project that's looking at kind of the interconnections of transnational migration, looking at the connection between gender, race, and strategies of ethnic whitening in a time of slavery in Cuba. So Margaret has a long history at this stage of work and of rich scholarship on the topic of Irish migration to Cuba, and her PhD, which she got in NUI Galway in 2012, was called Irish Migration to Cuba, 1835 to 1845, Empire, Ethnicity, Slavery and Free Labour. And Margaret joins us today as president of the Society of Irish Latin American Studies, of SILAS. And as I mentioned earlier, I had the pleasure of working with her on the book that we published on Ireland and Cuba, Entangled Histories. So Margaret is taking us in a slightly different direction, different time frame, and to a very different part of the island of Cuba, and to a different family, the O'Burks. So I'll hand it over to you, Margaret, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks, Nuala. And I have it's wonderful to come at this end of such a brilliant panel who have given wonderful papers, but also set the context for me as to the history of slavery and Irish migration in Cuba. What's in a name? I'm going to talk about the O'Burke women of Cienfuegos, Cuba. The Cuban historian María del Carmen García Zequiera, in her publication, Los Ilustres Apellidos Negros en La Habana Colonial, published in 2008, she writes from the perspective of the Black population, whose enduring legacy and heritage in Cuban culture, she argues, is foreshadowed by European perspectives, privileging, generally speaking, illustrious white male personalities in the formation of the Cuban nation. Irish surnames as a category of investigation in the connections between Europe and Cuba portray a diversity of class, from wealthy white elites to settler families and migrant labourers. And we've heard about some of those from the previous panelists. In this afterlife of slavery, and on the advice of scholar Lisa Lowe, who says that, and I quote, "We need to pay productive attention to the scene of loss," end quote. My talk today adopts a different approach to the history of Irish surnames. This approach is one of counter-memory that investigates surnames as signifiers of property in enslaved people. This suggests that genealogical research should pay more attention to teasing out the distortions and silences created by naming practices in the social order of plantation slavery. There are thousands of records in the Cuban archives with Irish surnames, which in the context of plantation slavery were not confined to Irish family lineages. They appear in a wide range of sources in connection with people of African origin who were enslaved by immigrants from Ireland and their descendants. So we can argue that Irish surnames in the context of Caribbean slavery open a space of investigation into the power dynamics of slavery and Irish entanglement in the broader historical links between settler colonialism, migration, and the Atlantic slave trade. And the archives that I'm working from here are the provincial archives in Cienfuegos. And I'm also drawing heavily on research and publications by the American historian Bonnie Lucero, who has done very close studies of the port city of Cienfuegos, and one of the women I'm going to speak about. So this microhistory of Irish migration to Cuba starts with the family name O'Burke, or O'Burke as it's pronounced there. And they're in the port city of Cienfuegos. Oh, next slide, Nuala, sorry, the map. I think we have a map coming next, no. Okay, the O'Burke family. So the story is told from two different perspectives, that of Marina O'Burke, whose father was Irish and from Limerick, and that of Matilde O'Burke, whose mother was African-born, affiliated to the Ganga nation in Sierra Leone. Today, fourth generation O'Burkes in Cienfuegos trace their roots to John Burke, born in Rathkeil, County Limerick in 1794, son of James and Mary Burke. John arrived in Trinidad in Cuba around 1820, where he set up a medical practice under the name of Don Juan O'Burke y Burke. As he had moved to a Spanish colony, he marked his Irish identity by attaching an O to his surname, and he also included his mother's surname, Burke, adapting to Spanish naming conventions. And some of the items on this slide are from the family archive, where they had documents with the Burke name associated with the Burkes of Mayo, also his grandson here, and 2 great-grandsons. In 1822, he married Nicolasa Palacios, a native of Trinidad and of wealthy Spanish parents. They had 10 children, and in 1832 moved the family to Cienfuegos, where sugar plantations were on the rise, rapidly expanding. The original founding charter of Cienfuegos in 1819 designated the city a white colony in which slavery would exist. White settlers were recruited from Europe, and though predominantly French, Spanish and Portuguese and Italian immigrants were also amongst the early colonists. The arrival of the O'Burke and other Irish settler families to Cienfuegos characterises Ireland's entanglement in the linked worlds of trans-imperial settler colonialism in the Caribbean and the African slave trade in the Atlantic world. John O'Burke bought a sugar plantation in the outskirts of Cienfuegos, and he called it Nueva Ibernia, clearly a signifier again of his provenance and Irish identity. O'Burke died in 1843, leaving the plantation estate and 37 enslaved Africans to his own 10 children. This was a sizable inheritance. You can go on to the next slide, which gives you the map. So you can see Trinidad, they're marked in red on the map. Matilde O'Burke then, a young child born into slavery on the O'Burke plantation, was not sold as part of the estate, becoming instead the property of the eldest O'Burke daughter, Marina, who now at the age of 15 had become a slave owner in her own right. She later married Ignacio Maria de la Torre, a prominent Cienfuegos merchant and planter, and became a larger player in the slave economy of Cuba. Just like her Irish father, her mother, her brothers, she would invest in and profit economically and socially from the institution of slavery. Her role extended beyond the domestic sphere and managing the plantation household. She bought and sold enslaved people, forming what Stephanie Jones-Rogers describes as, and I quote, pecuniary ties that constituted primary economic relations with African bondage. Indeed, the records show, and you can move to the next slide, that Marina O'Burke bought and sold enslaved people with her husband Ignacio and her brother Rafael O'Burke. In Cienfuegos in 1850, they bought 11 enslaved people from Jacobo Ros de Bayamo at a cost of 2,200 pesos. And you can see from the centerpiece in the slide here, the names of the people that they bought. This is a bill of sale. They're items in the records of a public notary called Dorticos, written in the Convention of Notarized Commercial Transactions. And you'll see enslaved people are given labels to categorize them more as objects or chattel. Here people are labeled according to their ethno-cultural affiliations in different regions of Africa and are listed as units of value. This kind of legal discourse was fundamental to the structures and commerce of slavery, and it describes how the theft and erasure of African names was hidden by the designation of European names. Again, as Cuban historian Garcia describes it, on their arrival in the New World, they were designated in a different way, leaving behind rhythmic and diverse names like Odelanu, Ajibu, Lalani, resonant of waterfalls, birdsong, or the whistling wind. In their new context, Africans were baptized with names of virgins and saints, according to the conventions of the Catholic Church. End quote. Documents in the colonial archives portray the administration of slavery in a discourse and language that subsumes the violence and dehumanization of captive Africans. Saidia Hartman, in her research, feminist historian, her research into the archives of slavery, she tries to do more than recount the violence that deposited these traces of African lives in the archive. And she asks, how does one recuperate lives entangled with the account books that identified them as items, as units of value, the invoices that claimed them as property, and the banal chronicles that stripped them of human features? Or can we, as Nurbese Philip suggests, conjure something new from the absence of Africans as humans that is at the heart of these texts? So now I'm going to turn to Matilde O'Burke, who liberated herself from slavery by buying her freedom from her owner. On the 22nd of April, 1871, Marina O'Burke, accompanied by her husband, Ignacio de la Torre, as required by law for a married woman to execute a notarized transaction. She couldn't sign it on her own. She signed an affidavit that would emancipate Mathilde on payment of freedom dues. Mathilde was 25 years of age at the time, and Marina was 43. And the document reads as follows. You can see it there on the slide below the English translation. I save and liberate from all captivity and servitude my black criolla, my slave named Mathilde O'Burke, 25 years of age and registered in this vicinity. This liberty is for the amount of 1,300 escudos or 650 pesos. This affidavit then sets out a payment plan by which Mathilde can pay the full amount to secure her freedom over a 6-month period. So this purchase of her freedom transformed her life from being property to becoming a person with legal personhood. Once free, Mathilde, like many black women of the time, like many free black women of the time, exercised her right to own property and began to acquire land. She maintained her relationship with the O'Burke family and for the next 3 decades borrowed substantial amounts of money from Marina O'Burke and from Marina's daughter, also called Marina. Mathilde moved then to the small town of Cruces, midway between Cienfuegos and Santa Clara. And by the 1890s, she owned multiple properties worth over 10,000 pesos. And they were in Cruces and also close to the urban center of Cienfuegos. Her business acumen and strategic investments benefited the wider community in the development of Cruces. Mathilde became a member of the society called Luz de Oriente, set up to provide educational projects for a growing community of color. Meetings were held in her home, and her son was the treasurer. She saw the town grow and develop in the aftermath of slavery and lived there until her death in 1924. She had 6 children, baptized and registered with all but one, given her surname, O'Burke. Mathilde's extraordinary economic mobility in a time of financial depression, you can move on to the next slide, in Cuba was dependent on her ability to secure loans and her smart use of credit. She maintained social ties with multiracial networks of creditors, borrowing substantial sums from Spanish merchants and a Chinese businessman and also her former owners, the O'Burke family. Mathilde secured or paid back loans to different merchants at least once every year and often many more times annually, for which she mortgaged her own properties as collateral, retaining full ownership when the loan was paid. She used this collateral to help other people of African descent, and in 1897, she provided a loan of 1,200 pesos to the Cabildo Real Congo. This was a Black religious and mutual aid society for people from Africa and of African descent captured from the slave trading hubs of West Central Africa. Though Mathilde's relation to members of the Cabildo was much deeper than merely finances, these people were also her family. Throughout her life, she maintained strong connections with the African diaspora at the same time as forging productive credit links and networks with wealthy white merchants. And as Bonnie Lucero says, Mathilde's economic and social relations transgressed racial boundaries and tested social constructions of race and the struggle for racial equality and Black inclusion in the discourse of a separate Cuban nation. So in conclusion, the epistemological challenges to understanding interrelated Irish and African diasporic histories in Cuba and the wider Caribbean necessitate engaging with the colonial archive. And sources in the Cuban archives provide some concrete and elaborate accounts, as we've heard from already today. Others are sparse, fragmentary, unstable, and unreliable records of Irish immigrants. And we've also heard why that might be, people hiding their connection to slavery. But it shows that you can read from them their interactions with Black, captive, and diasporic lives. This requires research, much more research, and research that is mindful of the limits of the archives, distorted by protocols of coloniality and power, in which the annihilating violence of the plantation system and the dehumanization of Black bodies as property is naturalized. So to think historically in this, and to use Saidiya Hartman's term, the afterlife of slavery, to think historically about Irish interactions with the African diaspora in Cuba means to engage with the archives of Atlantic slavery and pays attention in a way that pays attention to the discourses of racialized slavery and violence associated with Irish family names found in the Cuban archives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And again, a really fascinating overview of these really incredible figures, and so many questions, I suppose, about the relationship between Matilde and Marina, and so many details still to be uncovered, or perhaps not ever to be uncovered. I'm conscious that now we may have some time for questions, and that we can hear a little bit of the comments from our audience who have been joining in and listening with enthusiasm, I'm sure. So I'm going to just, I want to ask a general question, and then I'm going to come to a couple of comments that have come in on the chat. And I'm struck by the phrase that you used, Giselle, which was that this is part of a shameful footnote in Irish history. And it's possibly a question for everybody on the panel, but I'm going to start with you, Giselle, if I may, and just ask you, do you think that is changing? How do you see the kinds of research that you're doing and the uncovering of this, you know, the extent of Irish involvement in slavery in Cuba, to what extent that is changing narratives around Irish migration? So Giselle, if you can unmute yourself for a minute. Yeah,
yes,
great.
Thank you, Nuala. Yes, it is changing indeed. In the last few years, especially there has been a group of publications that have came out after Nini Rogers' terrific, very good book about slavery and its relation to Ireland. And I'm thinking of most recently, there have been a few studies on mostly the British Caribbean and what is the relationship there of Irish immigrants with slavery. I think there's some research has been done also in the US, looking at port cities and looking at merchant communities that were Irish and how were they interacting with the West Indies and with Cuba specifically. I still think that the research on the Spanish Caribbean is still starting in a way. There is, I think, some research done on Puerto Rico and comparing Irish immigrants and indentured servants with African slaves. And our own research on Cuba is still kind of like just starting. So I think we are looking to transform it from a footnote that it's given in more general histories of the diaspora into its own kind of like prominent subject, because I think it is important to deal with how complex were the societies, especially in the Spanish Caribbean, for Irish immigrants, where they had to change their name, they had to change their language, and they had to coexist with slavery. So I don't know exactly if this answers your question, but
no, it very much does, Giselle, and I wish we had more time to explore this, because I suppose
yes.
It speaks very much to what Margaret said when she quotes Hartman about the afterlife of slavery, and that this discussion and this discovery of the extent of Irish embeddedness in these processes is so important for us to discuss and to have a conversation about. And I suppose I'm thinking about the wider conversation that's happening as part of Douglas Week, and that is really offering us an opportunity to explore these questions in more depth, and to really think about this in a way perhaps that we are not accustomed to doing. And I think that's why the research is so welcome and so wonderful to listen to. I'm under pressure from the team to finish this up in a moment or two. There are many people putting comments who are hugely interested in history of abolition in Cuba, in the history of the Quaker community in Cuba. A listener who's wondering if Giselle is going to publish a book with her findings, and we'd be delighted to read that. We will hope that is the case, and will happen soon. I'm going to, there's a question which is specifically about Margaret's presentation, and I will direct that one to you, Margaret, which is that the noting of ethno-cultural locations is intriguing to them, and that this seems not to have been the case with slave purchases in the American colonies. So they're wondering if that practice is a distinctive one. And I wonder if you could answer that question in terms of what you've discovered with your own research.
It's certainly, I mean, obviously very common in Cuba, and it was the practice. I really can't say if it extended to places like Puerto Rico or other, you know, Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. But I think it did exist in Brazil, you know, as part of in different areas. But I'm not. It's not something I've studied. But it's an interesting question and one that's worth looking into.
Yes. And I'm going to finish up with a comment from a member of the audience who says, thanks to everyone for such great research. For many of us, this is a new topic in Irish studies. The origins of the Irish involvement in slavery have been obscured. And of course, Margaret has mentioned that explicitly as part of her presentation. And Kerby, Gera and Giselle, you have so beautifully illuminated the role played by James Jenkinson Wright in this and pointed to the myriad other histories and stories that are out there about the Irish involvement during this period. So I want to end by thanking you sincerely for sharing your research with us today from all of these distinct locations. We have many different time zones here today. So we are immensely grateful in Cork that you have all taken the time to share your research with us and with the audience, the results of this archival work that is shedding light on this very obscure topic in Irish migration studies. And finally, to say thank you to the Douglas team who are putting on such a fantastic program this week, and to encourage all of those listening here this evening to check out more of the Douglas Week events. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you so much, Nuala. Thank you to all our speakers for a really fantastic panel. And I'm sorry to cut you off. We have another session beginning at 6:30. So thank you so much. Thank you from the Douglas Week team. And do keep an eye out on the rest of our events. We have a panel session later, Douglas's genres, looking at the different genres that Douglas played upon in his life. And thank you. And we hope you enjoyed, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.